You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by...
Tracy McMillan. How are you doing, Jeff?
I'm good. How are you, Tracy?
I'm doing well.
So this is a special occasion, and not because the infrastructure bill was passed, but because this is the 100th episode of Mondays at the Overhead Wire.
Oh my goodness. It seems apropos that the 100th episode of the Overhead Wire is happening in actual Infrastructure Week.
That's right. It is
Come
actual
on!
Infrastructure Week. 100 episodes, 100 infrastructures.
Woo! Well, it's great to be here with you. It means a lot that you asked me to be on this episode, so thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for coming on all these times, and thanks to Chrissy too. She said she might be here, maybe not. We'll see. She has some busy stuff because you and her have jobs outside of this podcast, so you all do really wonderful work. But I do want to thank you, many times over, just for all the times you've come on the show. Chrissy too. All the guests that we've had on the show. We can't do all this stuff without you all, and I appreciate it tremendously. Making you all do homework before we come here. I don't make you do anything, but I'm like, can you read these pieces before we talk about them?
It's great. It's important homework. It's great stuff for my job. So
Yeah. And I've told you this before, I think, but when the pandemic first started, it was a little scary, and I think we were all a little bit worried about the outcome and stuff. And during the pandemic, I think I got a little bit more stressed out about doing the show and trying to read up and trying to follow all the stuff. And I think I've told you that before the show, I was always kind of apprehensive about getting on and chatting. But then, having you all on and being able to talk with you, and then at the end of the show, I always feel way better than I did when I started. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I felt the same way. And like we joked about when we were doing the podcast early on in the pandemic, I was Shut-ins Anonymous.
That's right. Shut-ins Anonymous.
Yeah. And it was certainly a lifeline. And transportation didn't stop. I mean, it evolved during the pandemic in so many interesting ways. I think we all learned so much, and we got to talk about it. The natural experiment, good and bad, and everything that was happening. And from a transportation standpoint, it was really interesting. And maybe even some of the lessons that were learned over the past year and a half helped to bolster what went into and was supported in the transportation bill that was passed.
I think so. And we'll get to talking into that in a bit. I have a kind of a list of things, and I think some of the stuff actually did make it into the bill that we found out during the pandemic. Especially, I just read a piece. I've been kind of digesting this kind of list from the National Association of Counties. But one of the things that's in the bill is transit worker safety. That's one of the things. So I think that there's been some lessons that have been taken and put into this. There's goods and there's bads in the bill. Obviously, there's stuff that got taken out because of the compromises and whatnot. But we'll get to that in a second. But this is episode 100. We are in session. We're not anonymous anymore, and we're not shut in. Before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both Mondays at the Overhead Wire and Talking Headways on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. And with this being the 100th episode, we're getting dangerously close to 500 total episodes of both shows, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. And thanks to all the folks who subscribe through the podcatchers. We really appreciate that because it keeps you coming back and you keep listening to the show, and we really appreciate that. So, well, here's the news. Here are a few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. Obviously, I put together kind of the list of stuff that we talk about on Thursdays, and then Friday they decide to release the hounds and vote on an infrastructure bill on a Friday night, no less, which is that's where I tweeted this. I was like, this is where ideas go to die as a Friday night news cycle, but they did it anyway. So I guess we're still talking
We
about
had a
it.
nice Twitter exchange
That's
because
right.
I was on a plane. I got off the plane. I'm like, man, all right. So I get off the plane and they pass an infrastructure bill. Can I get on the plane again and build that banner? And your response was great. Yeah, go somewhere else at Christmas time and we'll pass a voting rights bill.
That's right. That's all.
I'd
That's
be
what
happy
we
to do
need.
that.
And going anywhere for Christmas?
No plans yet, but that is good. Good reason to go.
Well, let's start out with a couple of odd stories, and then we'll get to the main one, which is the infrastructure stuff. But an interesting finding out of France on local bookshops. During the pandemic lockdowns, the French government reimbursed delivery fees for books, which resulted in a 70% retention of business. In 2020, independent bookshops as a whole saw a 3.3% reduction in business. With that success, the French government is now looking at a fixed price for book delivery to keep companies like Amazon from squashing local competition. This was really interesting to me just from the standpoint of supporting kind of local businesses over the conglomerates, supporting kind of the history of places. I think France has a unique ability to do this. I mean, they have laws that mean that you have to have bread shops in every small town that have to remain open. Bread laws and things like that from the revolution. So this is really interesting to me that there are bookshops, because I love bookshops. I love the idea of bookshops. I love my local bookshop, which I tell lots of people to go to. And then if you have a local bookshop and you haven't been able to go, we always say go to bookshop.org and you can help your local bookstore. But I don't know. What do you think, Tracy, about just this general idea of saving local business through kind of making sure that the big conglomerates don't have a leg up?
I think it's really important and fantastic. We know how important those businesses are for our communities. And I remember shortly after we went into shelter in place, I specifically went, Book Passage was one of the independent bookstores that was closest to me where I was living in Mill Valley at the time. And we went online and we placed a book order of a bunch of books. That's the way I order books anyhow. If I'm going to order them or I go in, I mean, there's nothing better than wandering through a bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also an important experience that I love to share with my son. And we go and we get lost in the bookstore, and he'll come up to me a little while later with a stack of books, yay high. He's like, "Is this okay, Mom?" I'm like, yeah, of course, for
You
so
wanna
many
read.
reasons. Yeah.
Of course.
But I think, obviously the pandemic was a very, as we were just saying, such a traumatic experience in so many ways. And it brought to light a lot of the disparities. And while the opportunity to shop without leaving your home was a very great convenience, there were other ways that you could access local services. And when things are in place to enable that, all the better. And whether it's platforms to help you connect to local shops or regulations to help support the role of local businesses within communities, it's really important. I wish there was more that we did here in the U.S. at times to do that.
Yeah, I do wish we had some programs or something, local that would help some of these stores and storefronts. And I know here in San Francisco, obviously we have kind of the anti-chain rules, but sometimes that's a little bit heavy-handed as well. I mean, if you started a chain in San Francisco and it was the original store, and then you left and then wanted to come back and open another store, and you have 4 stores or 5 stores or whatever the number is, it's a small number, then you can't open it because you're a chain. It's a little silly, but I think we can make some exceptions for some of these local businesses that are part of the heart of communities. So I think that's an important way to go. And it's not, bookshops are a little bit different, I think, than other consumer goods in a certain way, from a neighborhood cohesiveness standpoint and a character standpoint. But there's something to be said for local businesses more generally, in addition to the bookshops.
Yeah, it's interesting how I read something recently that we're to the point where even Barnes and Noble is being considered more and more a local bookstore as opposed to the national chain bookstore, because they're not as ubiquitous as they used to be. And also the big behemoth is Amazon now. So in some communities, Barnes and Noble is the only bookstore, and it is a local gathering place. It is where events happen. It is the bookstore, and so it's not even as black and white as the small business providing that service to support the local community.
Absolutely. All right, so we go on?
Yeah.
Indoor methane leaks are worse than we knew. Research comparing data from before and during the pandemic found that tiny methane leaks from natural gas in homes make up a larger proportion of city emissions than previously realized. Methane is particularly bad for the climate, making up 20% of emissions. The finding is fueling calls for a move away from natural gas and towards electrification sooner rather than later. This was by Daniel Grossman and Yale Climate Connections. I love my gas range, and I know that some folks out there who are moving towards electrification might be horrified by that. I know that at some point I'm going to have to go to electrify my appliances. I just wonder if that's going to be a reasonable request for everybody so quickly without some sort of a funding mechanism or some sort of a realization that there needs to be some sort of help to get there.
Yeah, I mean, that's usually what follows, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was it in San Francisco or California as a whole that there was recent legislation that was prohibiting no more natural gas hookups in new development?
I think it's Berkeley and I think it's San Francisco potentially. I can't remember exactly, but there are cities individually that are starting to require that new connections be all electric. But I know that there's a bunch of people who are food fanatics who are frustrated because of the history of gas. I think Montreal did something similar and to ban coal or wood burning stoves. And then the bagel industry, which is big in Montreal, obviously was very upset about that too. So there's something there about assuaging people's fears of losing some culture. I think it's necessary eventually, obviously, to go electric, but there needs to be some kind of making sure that everybody can, get to the place where they're comfortable with getting to the final destination.
True, but it would be a little hypocritical if we're, riding our bikes and reducing our trips, but we're not willing to give up our natural gas, right?
That's
That is
true.
A climate.
Well,
that's such a climate impact.
It's true. But it's like I said, it's easier for me to get rid of my car because I don't have one. Than just kind of toss out my gas stove. But I'm not saying that I'm not going to do it. It's it's like when the people are like I'll never get rid of my car. That's not how I feel about gas stoves. I'm not saying I'm never going to get rid of my gas stove. It's just it's going to happen at some point because it needs to, right? We need to change over. So
yeah, I mean this is a great article. I really wasn't up to speed on the extent of the impact that methane has. It also makes me, it feels like it's almost every week there is a story about a natural gas leak somewhere in the Phoenix metro area. And I'm sure it's not only one, but there's one that's made the news, the news cycle. And this article made me go, oh, right, there was one down the street from us a few weeks ago.
Well, there was a whole, here in the Bay Area, there's been a couple where it just blew up whole neighborhoods from a natural gas leak. So there's a danger there that's in addition to the climate change issue. But there's also really cool technologies now that they're starting to implement. I saw one the other day because obviously I'm looking at this stuff because I'm like, well, I'm going to have to do it eventually. So electric stoves that they have the little lights, the LED lights that show you how hot or cold the heat is. So it looks like the flame, but it's not this, it's obviously electric. So you have like this digital readouts and stuff.
Cooktops are supposed to be amazing.
Cool stuff. Yeah. Yeah. So, I just need to figure out how to cook on it. That's it. All right, Vienna, Austria. Vienna, Austria's visionary flood management. Catastrophic flooding hit Germany and Belgium in July after record rainfall across Europe. But Viennese flood managers weren't worried because the city had built flood prevention systems in the 1980s to protect from 10,000-year flood events. The city had flooded throughout history, and engineers knew that to protect it in the future, a vision needed that would have to be big. Denise Hruby at the Washington Post. I know I post a lot. We talk a lot about these flood prevention articles. I feel like we had one recently about the Dutch. I posted one yesterday from CNN about the Dutch, that what they're doing. For me, I think that there's something to be said about these flood management projects that's tied to like transportation and housing in a very specific way. We know there are going to be all these people coming to our regions, but there's no single like flood event that equals, or transportation event or housing event that's like a flood event that gets people working. We all know how to plan for the future. We just don't do it because there's like no flash impetus like there is for a flood, which makes the Dutch or the folks in Vienna or other places that have made these big investments, that doesn't make them jump out of their seats and start to do it. So there's like a connection there between these infrastructures for 10,000 year futures that we're not getting for transportation and housing.
Thank you for sharing this article. One, it reminds me I've got to go back to Vienna. It was 21 years ago where I did my research fellowship in Vienna, and I haven't been back since, but it's a great city. And I mean, so much of their planning was forward thinking then, and it continues to be forward thinking. And this also made me think about, I think there was an article in the Chronicle or SF Gate last week. It must have been after the atmospheric rain or the bomb cyclone, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the bomb
you
cyclone.
know, that hit like
Yeah.
a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. And it was an article, and it's not the first one, it's one in a series talking about the Embarcadero and how that is extremely vulnerable to events like this, as is a lot of areas in the Bay Area. I mean, I know Mill Valley, again, was often underwater at least once per winter during a king tide cycle. And if it would have been tied to an event, if there had been a king tide with the amount of rain that hit Marin County in that cycle, I don't know where the water level would have been.
Right.
It would have been really significant.
Yeah, that's the crazy part. So I think the San Francisco Chronicle piece was about raising the Embarcadero 7 feet. They said they'd have to do in the next 20 years or so, 20, 30 years. And that's a lot of height on there, because otherwise, if they don't, it ends up a New York City subway situation where, you know, the Embarcadero is right where the Muni comes out of the Market Street Tunnel.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
if you flood that causes a lot of problems, especially since that's the only tunnel with BART and Muni that goes in the city. So the king tides are, like you mentioned, are a huge issue. And if folks don't know what a king tide is, it's basically high tide plus a full moon madness that pulls the tide up even further. And so it's you know, if you do get those 3, 4, or 5 inches of rain and the king tide's up, you're not going to get that out into the water, into the bay. So trouble with that. I think that's something that I think a lot of cities around the country are going to have to grapple with. And there are some, I think there are some provisions in the infrastructure bill for that type of investment, but it's not going to be enough for everybody. So you know, something that we definitely need to worry about.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we're working on a project with the town of Windsor in Sonoma County, and while our focus a lot of it has been on wildfire risk and emergency evacuation procedures for wildfire risk, they sit adjacent to a fair amount of floodplain related to the Russian River and some of the other creeks that are up in that area, and there are flood events that can occur. And like this article features, and lots of articles on flood, our frequency of those events and what would be an infrequent event, a 100-year flood, has changed. You know, whether our planning and our modeling is keeping up with the evolution of our systems is really important to note and get ahead of, like it sounds like they did in Vienna.
10,000 years, that's a big amount of time. If you have a 10,000 year flood, I think we're in bigger trouble than
Ooh, yeah.
But unfortunately,
2
when
by
I get
2.
there. Yeah, 2 by 2, exactly. Okay, also a reference to San Francisco. There was a frustrating night on Tuesday, October 26th, and a lot of folks who are from the Bay Area or from San Francisco and in the housing wars on Twitter will know this date, as it will go down in infamy. But the San Francisco Board of Supervisors majority blocked 495 housing units, 25% affordable, that were on top of a valet lot for the department store at right next to the Powell Street BART station. I can't make this up. They blocked it, worried about, in part, part of the worry for them, they rejected the environmental impact statement. And I can understand if you wanting to pause it because you're worried about the footings for a large building after what's happening with one of the towers in downtown San Francisco. Obviously, there's a issue with going down to bedrock and making sure that you're earthquake safe. But there was also a complaint about gentrification that obviously a parking lot is parking for cars, and there's nobody to displace from there. Since then, the supervisors have been digging their heels, saying they're pro-housing, and SFMB actually produced a report saying, basically Dean Preston had rejected over the last several years, 8,000 or so units. The folks that have blocked it, including my supervisor, Raphael Mandelman, have been kind of very defensive on Twitter about this because they continue to be called anti-housing. But ultimately, if you want to be pro-housing, you should approve housing units, and they're not doing that, especially in specifically this project. It was very egregious rejection of housing, along with some of the other progressive supervisors. So in San Francisco is kind of a weird politics, Tracy. I know you know this, but it's a very, everybody's fairly liberal, but you have the progressives versus the liberals, which, I guess a lot of people will call it's not like the right versus the left, it's the left on the left. And it's kind of, I guess people would call the leftists centrists or something. I don't know. Or the progressives very left, or socialist, or whatever it is. I don't know. But it gets all muddled about what the definitions are. So it's an interesting thing. But as I've always said here in San Francisco, I don't really care if it's public housing. I don't care if it's affordable housing. I don't care if it's market rate housing, if it has affordable units, because we have those requirements. Let's just build it. Build the housing, especially if it's on a parking lot. So it's just super frustrating to see this kind of stuff happen, and more housing units continually get shot down throughout the city. And, the thing that I feel like they never ask themselves is what happens when those 8,000 people or 8,000 units, whatever, how many thousands of people, where do they go? Because they're not just disappearing. It's not,
Right.
it's not just the people don't exist. Are they going to Oakland and frustrating their housing situation there? Are they going to the Central Valley? Are they going to somewhere with a high VMT profile? Are they traveling back to San Francisco for work? Would they be able to walk or bike instead of take transit? There's all these questions I have about, and I know that, one of the arguments is that, we can't be we can't provide the housing that the rest of the region won't supply. And I agree with that. We can't. But if everybody pulled their weight, we could actually get back on track in terms of providing housing. So that's kind of my little soapbox thing. I was really frustrated by that. I usually don't get into the housing wars on Twitter. It's just not my style generally. Transportation is more my thing, but it's just made me so mad.
So I haven't been able to read all the articles associated with this. Was it an outright rejection, or is this back to the drawing board? Please address the concerns we have, and then we'll consider this again, or...
It's for now it's a rejection because they declined to certify the environmental statement. And so, I think some of them will say that they could live with it if it makes some changes to the earthquake stuff. But others are, they think that it should be, 100% affordable housing, or they should think it should be something else that it can't be. And so it's frustrating from that standpoint. I hope that they bring it back, and I hope that it actually passes at some point because of all the backlash that they're getting, because they're getting a lot of it. Because this project, it's housing units that are ready to go. Somebody has funding lined up for it. There's even 25% affordable. It's not like it's just all market rate housing. And market rate has a weird connotation, and all housing is going to cost a lot of money in the Bay Area just because of construction costs and things like that. So that's it's a whole mess of discussion that we don't need to have today, but
it is interesting though. I mean, it's just
frustrating.
It's frustrating also from the standpoint of how long these processes take. And I've seen Sarah Jones, who just moved on from SF planning to go over to Marin County. I can't remember her exact title that she's going to over there, but it's an inordinate amount of time to move this along. And these are people's lives that need homes. And my sister-in-law lives in South Carolina, and she started a project back in 2010, 2011, and they are just now about to break ground.
Whoa. Yep.
I mean, that's just insane.
Yeah.
Everything that they had to do, it's just incredible. I mean, there were lots of different layers involved in it, but I don't think it's abnormal.
It shouldn't take
all the
that
hoops
long.
you have to jump through.
Well, not for, yeah, no, for cities around the country. I mean, and they're all going to turn into San Francisco eventually if it keeps going down this road. I mean, Austin is seeing some crazy price increases because of, basically, and for years I've talked about this on the show before, for years they've had this escape valve to Williamson County and to Hayes County, because a lot of people would move out there because they couldn't, build something new in Austin. And so I think some of those are shutting down a little bit. And then the transportation situation is such that, you get really frustrated with that. And if you can't build in the core where people want to live, then the people are going to have to go further out and the traffic gets worse. And there's all these the circumstances that create this situation they're not just San Francisco. It's all over the country. And I think Austin eventually, because of the way things are going, and even maybe it's cities in South Carolina and everywhere else, they're going to turn into San Francisco because they don't build enough housing. It's frustrating. You could tell I'm like, yeah. All right. Sydney's urban think tank is calling for transportation authorities to start thinking about fare policy for the new long weekend as travel patterns shift post-pandemic. As work from home policies continue, regions will need to address these types of cluster commuting. So this is in The Guardian. And Sydney's urban think tank is run by Gabriel Metcalf, who used to be head of Spur, which is really interesting. You saw that. You're like, who's the? Yes. Oh, that name sounds really familiar.
Yeah.
After he left here, he went there. This, I don't want to talk about this too long, but I just think this idea of cluster commuting is really interesting, where basically you have a couple of days where you go to work because of the pandemic. And if you work from home to a certain amount of time, you have a couple of days where you go to work and then a couple of days where you're not. So maybe you go to work on Monday, Tuesday, and then you don't go to work on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or you go to work on Wednesday and Thursday, and you don't go to work on Monday and Friday and Tuesday. There's the clusters of grouping of days where you do or don't go. What this means for the transportation system as a whole, I think it's going to generate, because of, not everybody obviously can work from home, but because there's so many people that will be working from home, it's going to make transportation a little wonky, I think, for a little bit.
What I thought was also interesting about this article and talking about housing is what Gabe Metcalf was saying in terms of what they see as the impact that changing commuting pattern will have on the central business district, and what measures they recommend putting in place to help the businesses in the CBD that will be negatively impacted by not having the worker population coming to the central business district, which also suggests, it wasn't stated, but it suggests that there's no housing in the central business district. So it's not a live and work environment. It's just a work environment, and people leave, they come in the morning and they leave at the end of the day. And so that is another failure of how CBDs have been developed over time in various places, that you have dead space. And again, the pandemic has shined a bright light on some real failures in so many topics and areas where it doesn't have to be.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe people that are communities outside Sydney are like, well, hey, but our business districts or our downtowns are doing really well now, because we do have people that have normally left Monday through Friday, and we've had little ghost towns and really quiet downtowns midday, and now we have thriving and lively areas.
That's really interesting. I think that the fight for resources that might be contingent on the cluster commute or people not going into the CBD anymore in many cities. Here in San Francisco, at least during the pandemic, I felt like a lot of the neighborhoods were doing fairly well. I mean, not as good as they could, obviously, but then the CBD, downtown San Francisco, was was kind of a ghost town for a lot of it, and a mess. And I think it's starting to return a little bit now. But I think that's something that discusses the resilience of neighborhoods and places where people are living and being able to go shop and things like that from an economic standpoint, as opposed to making these central one-off districts. Like, I'm wondering what happened or what was going on in Tyson's Corner, for example, in right. Virginia, and what was going on in a number of different places. What was going on the Camelback corridor in Phoenix. Like, there's so many places that are mixed and diverse in their uses, and there's so many places that are monocentric or mono-use areas. And so that point that you made about the fight for resources is going to be really interesting, because a lot of these smaller places that might have been on the periphery before will see the benefits of actually keeping people around. And so maybe there will be a shift of some sort, and central business districts won't have the clout that they used to. I mean, I think they will, just because of the dynamics of having so many people close by to each other. But you never you never know what might be a new discussion point for some of these outer areas.
There's a nice regionalism theme in some of the pieces you picked.
I didn't mean to, but it's there. So next up, it's Infrastructure Week. I have a note here that I should mention that we won't be talking about the Munger dorm. I think there's been enough discussion about the Munger dorm.
Yeah. Wait, the e-bike, because that's not technically in the infrastructure bill. The credit, it's in the Build Back Better.
I didn't write it. I didn't do a summary for that. I didn't do a summary for that because I thought it was in the infrastructure bill, and I just totally passed it over as doing the notes. So the Build Back Better bill has, I think that is where the e-bike stuff is right? That's where they're discussing?
That's what Andrew says, Andrew Hawkins, in the article in The Verge, that it's part of the BBB. Right.
So in the BBB, which, by the way, Lydia DePillis, who writes for the Philadelphia Inquirer, who's an awesome writer, has a really amazing thread about all the stuff that's in the BBB. And she actually took the weekend and started reading through it line by line. It took her, I think, a couple of days, and she might even still be posting on it. I haven't gone back for about a half a day or so. But she has all kinds of really cool detailed stuff about the BBB, which folks should go check out if they get a chance. I know everybody here is tired of the horse race, and so if you want to know what's actually in it, go to her thread on Twitter and check it out, because there's stuff in there. But as for the e-bikes, I know that it got cut to 15% of a total, and now it's 30%. But then the limit is $5,000 for an e-bike, I think, or $3,000. I can't remember the exact number, but I know that there was some stuff that came out after some haggling last week that people were really frustrated with about, basically cutting out a lot of cargo bikes that people could buy. And just making it the e-bike. So there's been a lot of changes and things going on.
Yeah, 30% of a new e-bike purchase price capped at $1,500, which
so $1,500 would leave out a lot of those cargo bikes and those bike Fiats and things like that. So that's a part of that BBB bill, and there's so many things in there. Well, I'm sure we'll get to it at some point. If it passes, I hope it passes. I hope the progressives got the assurances they needed to pass that, because there's a lot of important stuff like that's in there. I know that. Well, let's avoid the horse race stuff. We can go into that later.
Yeah.
So this is $1.2 trillion bill. It's got $550 billion of new spending. Everything else is older spending. So it is a reauthorization of the transportation bill is included in this.
You just switched gears to the infrastructure bill.
Yes,
right?
This is the infrastructure bill. We're talking about the infrastructure bill. Let's talk infrastructure.
Okay. All right.
And it's called, so I think people were calling it the BIF and the BBB, but I think it's now called, let's see here, hang on.
Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act.
Yeah, so the
IIJA.
IIJA, that's right. So this is the IIJA, which I like the BIF better because it's easier to say BIF.
Yeah, this is the IIJA.
The IIJA, that sounds like IHA. IHA is...
IHA! Ja.
Ja.
Sehr gut.
Sehr gut. So it passed 228 to 206. What's in the infrastructure bill? So I'm going to go through a bunch of stuff and then we can talk about it. It's a kind of a long list, but I want people to kind of get an idea of what's in this thing. $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, $15 billion for lead drinking water pipe replacements, $39 billion for transit, of which $2.5 billion would go for low emission ferries and buses, $65 billion for the energy grid, $5 billion for grid reliability and resilience grants, $3 billion for smart grid grants, a credit program that would subsidize certain nuclear reactors that are at risk of closing due to economics, $6 billion over 5 years, $6 billion towards battery storage, $3 billion in grants for battery mineral processing, $3 billion in grants for various parts of the battery supply chain like manufacturing and recycling, $55 billion for water infrastructure, lead pipe replacements, PFAS contamination issues, $3.5 billion towards water infrastructure for Native American tribes, Aging infrastructure, 2.2 billion. FEMA, 3.5 billion for floods. Trees, tree planting services. They don't even give me a number of costs for this. Provisions on the infrastructure permitting process. So this was interesting, actually. I have to say, this is something I did not know and I was not paying much attention to, but it codifies the one federal decision concept that the previous president signed into law. Basically, it sets a 2-year goal to complete permitting for highway projects and renews some streamlining provisions from the 2015 highway bill. President Biden actually he wrote an executive order canceling out the previous executive order the first day he was in office, which canceled the Keystone Pipeline, which is a big deal for a lot of people. But now it's back in the infrastructure bill. And it basically, as far as I understand it, now people can maybe read a little more detail into this. As far as I can understand it, this means that you'll have a 2-year clock to do environmental processing, and it designates a single agency that's in charge of the whole process for permitting under this specific thing. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing to a certain extent. However, there might be some provisions in there or something in there that kind of messes up NEPA in some form or fashion. And I don't know. And the first thing I saw when I read this was that it actually impacts maybe, the discussion about Houston's highway expansion or any highway expansions. Obviously, they've been paused because they need to look through the impact statements on that for the impacts on, vulnerable communities, as it, takes out a lot of jobs and housing near that freeway. Highway, I'm trying not to say freeway anymore. So that's something that popped up in here that I was really interesting. It's called One Federal Decision. If you look it up online and Google One Federal Decision, it'll come back with some stuff. But that was interesting. $8 billion for freight and highway programs, $1 billion for Reconnecting Communities program, which we've talked about before. That's the one where, highways went through communities and tore them apart. There's $1 billion for the reconnection program. It used to be $10 billion, but now it's only $1 billion that got reduced. $25 million for the Threat to Pedestrians Competitive Grant Program. So there's going to be $25 million for monies for pedestrian safety. This is an interesting one. MPOs are required to consider the equitable and proportional representation of the population of the metropolitan area when designating officials or representatives. This section will also enhance coordination among MPOs designated within the same area. This is interesting to me for a number of reasons. Recently, San Diego, for example, Jerry Brown actually made them reconstitute their MPO such that it actually had better representation for San Diego, which was underrepresented before, because all the outlying areas, the suburban mayors and stuff had representation. I think this is where this is going, but it's a really interesting move to make sure that proportional representation for MPOs is a standard, because all these major cities that have an MPO, a lot of times they get outnumbered by the representatives from small towns around them. And so this is an interesting provision inside of this. $350 million for wildlife crossings, $250 million for reducing truck emissions at ports. I've always said I wanted electrification of the trains and the trucks at ports. That would be really interesting. $6.4 billion for carbon reduction, $8.7 billion for coastal resilience infrastructure and evacuation routes. I think this goes to the discussion we had earlier, thinking about flooding and those types of things. $500 million for a healthy streets program for communities of color. Eligible projects include the installation of cool or porous pavements and the expansion of tree cover with the goal of reducing urban heat island effects and improving air quality. I hadn't heard about that one before, so that's interesting. I guess I should have read through the bill earlier.
No, and that's they've been piloting cooler pavement surfaces here in Phoenix as part of the sustainability and urban heat island issue that obviously occurs here.
Definitely in Phoenix, right? It's hot. It's hot. $5 billion for Vision Zero programs. That's interesting. Bureau of Transportation Statistics would be directed to perform outreach to state and local planning and infrastructure decision-making officials to determine the data analysis tools needed to assist local communities in making infrastructure decisions.
Yeah.
Have you heard of this one before?
In the reading that I did, yes. And then I believe that I can't remember the order of all these things. Some of our team at Nelson Nygaard is involved in, we've responded to like the RFI related to justice. I mean, there's been so much information gathering by people to inform this process. And so I know that we've contributed and data. I mean, certainly we've been pushing for better data and more equitable data and more affordable and accessible data that would be helpful for communities and investment in data.
Right.
And I think it'll be interesting. A lot of communities, and there are a lot of businesses that are built on location data that's being gathered and harvested through everything we do on our devices
Right.
and our phones, and with privacy and a greater light being shown on how much information we're providing
Right.
to private companies through that. Who knows if that will be impacted in the future. So I think if we can think about one, more transparent data sources, and also, push for qualitative and quantitative data sources that are inclusive.
Yeah.
There. Okay, there's my data rant. And so I'm very happy with the data push in the bill.
Wait for tomorrow's newsletter. The first transportation article I think you'll really like tomorrow for the newsletter. Check it out. $500 million for demonstration projects on the following subjects: coordinated automation, connected vehicles, intelligent sensor-based infrastructure, systems integration, commercial delivery and logistics, drones, and smart grid technologies. I know that I think it was Carlton Reed, who writes for Forbes, kind of sent up a flare about beaconization. And beaconization is the requirement of basically bikes and pedestrians to have a beacon that talks to V2X, V2V, vehicle to everything communications. And I think that some folks are worried everybody will be required to have some sort of beacon. And I know that the technologists would love this. And so there's this worry about beaconization, especially if you are, lesser means and or lower income, and whether your vehicle or yourself doesn't have it, or whether the vehicles will disregard that you don't have one and then hit you, or there's a danger of it being creating more violence, traffic violence. So there's a frustration, I think, with that specifically coming out of the bill and the potential for it. I don't think there's anything specifically, but it's you're going to research this, they're going to figure out, and they're going to have a report in a couple of years that's going to maybe suggest this. So something to watch out for.
Yeah, I felt like I saw those tweets going through my stream over the past couple of days, and I'm like, I don't have the capacity to deal with this right now. I'll look into it. And is it an example of what we used to call like a pork barrel, like a little pet project that was dropped in there to fund a UTC? There's several that are, doing connected vehicle research. So they got their dollars and they can do their research, and we'll see what happens with that. So I wasn't going to bite on it too much, knowing those things.
That's fair. So $70 billion, well, there's an EV working group as well. So $70 billion for transit. The bill would make several changes to the program, raising the threshold for federal assistance from 100 to 150 million total project cost, and from 300 to 400 million for small starts projects. Requiring new starts, small starts, and core capacity improvement project applicants to make progress towards meeting the performance targets set in section whatever, I didn't read it, in order to receive a grant. Requiring core capacity improvement projects to be located in a corridor that is projected to be at or over capacity within the next 10 years rather than in the next 5 years before moving to the engineering phase. Allowing applicants to bundle multiple projects that meet certain requirements and restrictions, and requiring US DOT to establish a dashboard displaying information on each project seeking a grant agreement, which is kind of like the New Starts report. There's also a transit worker safety set-asides, assault on transit workers as data for the National Transit Database in there as well, which we talked about a little bit at the start of the show. TIFIA goes from 75 million to 150 million. And now here are some of the things that might be interesting, super interesting to folks. Allows counties to determine local roadway design. The MUTCD will be updated to remove the requirement that local roads must be built to state standards, allowing for counties and other local governments to use FHWA-approved roadway design of their choice. The IIJA also creates new standards to facilitate the rollout of EV charging stations, and also requires US DOT to update the MUTCD. The required update will provide for the protection of vulnerable road users, testing and integrating automated vehicle technology, the installation of electronic traffic. It also incorporates recommendations issued by the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices that have not been yet incorporated. MUTCD is a big deal lately, specifically. So, new population band within the surface transportation block grant for communities between 50,000 and 200,000 people to allow more equitable suballocation of funds. Competitive grants for at-rail grade crossings, creates 40 billion bridge replacement, Buy America requirements, and categorical exclusions for small projects. This threshold increases from 5 to 6 million, and for large projects from 30 to 35 million, making more projects eligible. So categorical exclusion from NEPA, or I think that some small starts projects get categorical exclusions, or streetcar projects, because they're in existing right of ways and things like that. So they might get more consideration. So that's all the stuff that I found interesting. There's obviously going to be a lot more that pops out, I think, when people start reading into detail. But I think that's a lot.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of detail in there, and the devil will be in the detail in some of these areas, in terms of the opportunity for positive change and the opportunity to maintain the status quo. One thing that I haven't heard much about, that I'm really curious about, particularly in relation to areas where people are disappointed that funding wasn't as great as originally desired, like the Reconnecting Communities program. I think you said it was originally hoped to be 10 billion, and now it's 1 billion. I think it's 110. There's a huge amount of money that is discretionary funding from the secretary, and I'll be honest, I don't know. I feel like I need to do a re-education on transportation policy and transportation funding, and how it will all be allocated and appropriated, and all the A words. And so what's in that discretionary? How discretionary is that discretionary funding, and is that the potential safe zone for something like the Safe Reconnecting Communities program that got cut, but it's a priority of the secretary? There's opportunity for more than the 1 billion.
Well, it looks like there's a 16 billion pot for mega projects in there too. So some of that 100 and something billion dollars for Secretary Buttigieg is going to be in that pot of money that goes to projects that don't fit anything else. It's like it's almost like puppies and butterflies. It's the articles that don't fit in the rest of the piece. Chrissy, are you here?
Hey, hi.
Oh, hey.
Hi, Chrissy.
Oh, so glad to have you.
I know. I don't want to interrupt. I hear what you're talking about, and that's.
Yeah. So there's that. I think the 16 billion pot for mega projects is in that. There's also like some VMT pilot stuff that's in. I'm probably in that thing that I mentioned earlier with the list of stuff for connected cars and all that. Ultimately, there's so much in this, and I think we might not even know, for a couple of years what's in it, honestly, because new stuff might be popping out, and there's so many different like buckets of money where you can pull from that you might be able to get transit funding out of something that nobody really expected to get transit funding out of, because of just the way that all of this stuff is organized and put through the process. There's billions for different competitive grant programs and money that you can kind of do a lot of different things with, even like in water infrastructure and things like that. You can start to think about it in different ways.
Seeing the pots of money open up to new modes like shared micromobility, and bike sharing is eligible, and scooter share under some programs under like CMAC, and congestion pricing is also included. And I should know, but I don't, whether that has been included in prior surface infrastructure bills, and under what categories. Like you said, there's a significant investment in roadway safety, and the safe systems approach that finally has made its way into FHWA, and I think we'll see a lot of hopefully positive change in hopefully a paradigm shift that's happening in the way we approach roadway safety here in the U.S.
There's probably a pot of money for that too.
Yeah. I think it's in these various pots of safety money that are there.
Yeah, there's $5 billion for Vision Zero programs and safe streets.
Yeah. Like you said, the vulnerable road user research,
Right.
The types of projects that are eligible for funding under HSIP is it's all really important to give agencies the ability to implement what their constituents are asking for and what they as professionals often want to do, but need to have the flexibility to do it, and the documentation to say, look, here, this is an FHWA proven safety countermeasure or whatnot, and we're okay to do that.
Chrissy, do you have any big picture thoughts on what's going on?
Well, just as you're talking, I was going back to the $100 billion discretionary fund and just how much of there's obviously a lot of the funding that appropriated, by line item to various categories, but there's also just all this discretionary funding, and probably like Tracy, I write a lot of grants to, try and help cities get this discretionary funding, and it just goes to show in 2 years, or just in 3 years, how important, because there's so much money that will get doled out by whatever administration is in charge. So, a lot of that could change the way that the discretionary program is viewed and who gets what, and what states are prioritized could change.
It's interesting when you think about how the discretionary funding has been used over the years. I mean, from Mary Peters to Ray LaHood to now Secretary Buttigieg. I'm sure they'll all use it in different ways, or even Elaine Chao. They take this discretionary money and kind of use it for sometimes political purposes, and sometimes they create the Tiger program. So. It's interesting to see what that might turn into, and I'm hoping that they're really good ideas that come out of it. And there's probably been some good ideas that come out of both sides, but it is interesting to see kind of how the pots of money get pushed around the map, as it were. It's almost like a game of Risk. So I think for me, the big takeaway from this is there's a lot of money in here going to a lot of places, and while I am frustrated that there's no fix it first, mechanism, I am frustrated that there's not a lot of, climate provisions that force, some places where you have formula funds, you have some places that are already ready to do they have a format that's ready for a climate change future. I think, a money that goes to an MPO in California is not going to be the same as money that goes to an MPO in Kansas from that standpoint. So, I think that there's going to be some of the money that we think is might not be great is going to go to places that are going to take care of it, and other places that'll probably expand roads and do those sort of things. So it'll be interesting to see at the end of this, how it all pans out. With all that being said, I think it's amazing something got passed with the way our government is structured. I'm interested to see the benefits that come out of this. It is frustrating that we're sitting in a world that's, we're worried about climate change. We're worried about what's been happening over the summer with all those heat domes. And Tracy, we're just mentioning the bomb cyclone and all the rain that's coming. With that, I think the BBB has a lot of stuff in it too, and we'll talk about that in the future. But these two together, I'm interested to see actually how it impacts climate in the future from a transportation standpoint.
Yeah, I can't remember if I've been on. I don't think I have been on the podcast since I did a trip to Nevada. We're doing a project with them, with the DOT there on their statewide mobility management plan, and we did a trip to Carson City to meet with some folks while they were having meetings there, and it was really great and inspiring and humbling to talk to them about all that they're trying to. And, Nevada is an incredibly rural state outside of Vegas area, Clark County, and Washoe County, where Reno is, and to be able to provide transportation, access to care, and activities of daily living, and daily needs, and how people have to move about, and the breakdowns in the various systems that set people up for failure. And I came back and I was like, darn it all. It's my nice way of saying it on the podcast.
I'll bleep it out if you want to say something bad.
damn it, this is why we need not only, this infrastructure bill, which is so important in terms of also not just thinking about infrastructure from surface transportation and how expansive it is. And I really am happy that it is preserved in that way. But why the Build Back Better is bill plan. It is so important as well, because that is the complementary scaffolding that can break down the silos that our systems operate in, that trap people and make life difficult and expensive and just creates these vicious cycles of unhealthiness and poverty, and so it's really important that people are true to their word and they take this bill up next and they get it passed.
Yeah.
There's just so much discussion on the infrastructure bill and how it's there. I mean, obviously there are a lot of issues with it, but it's still a huge investment in transit and rail, and building better communities. Like the agencies we're working with are going to see a huge investment. But I think for the Build Back Better, it's going to be interesting to see if the moderates in the House just need the SALT tax credit, if that's what wins them. If that's going to be really expensive, but anything that has to pass, because it is the parallel bill with all the climate money that will help mitigate like some of the road expansion we're about to see. I think we're going to have to swallow a lot in the Build Back Better with to what the moderates want, but I think it's something that will have to be done just to get it passed, because like Tracy said, it is the scaffolding to build up the infrastructure
I saw
bill.
someone tweet today that like getting 60% of what you want in a bill used to be the measure of success in Congress, and so
yeah.
let's keep it in perspective that that when they put this bill forward in the spring, it was pie in the sky, like everything that, and it was meant to stimulate conversation and to push people. There was never, I don't think, ever a thought that it would make it through the way it was originally intended, and that the idea that it's been broken into two pieces was probably also known as a very high probability or what was going to happen. And it was important to help this debate happen and to maybe get to two important bills, hopefully by the end of the year.
We saw the sausage being made, which you usually don't see. And, Bernie Sanders proposing $6 billion for the Build Back Better bill. And he knew that was just his top line number. Joe Manchin's giving in. That's what we all, obviously they all expected to happen. And the fact that we got the infrastructure bill passed and on the brink of, it's probably, I think, going to be another month or so before the next one is passed because of the process. I mean, that's still two historic bills in less than a year, no matter how you look at it.
I mentioned this top of the show that the stuff that gets talked about a lot is that political sausage making, not necessarily the technical sausage making. And I think the benefits of this will be if BBB passes, it'll be long ranging, and I think that it needs to be discussed what is in it, what's there, and because there's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of BS online about socialism, et cetera, but a lot of this stuff is very, very popular with people. I mean, we're one of the very few countries in the world that doesn't have paid leave after you have a child. That's important. Education stuff is important. Home assistance care is important, especially if you want to go to a job. There's just so much in there that people, I think, all agree is beneficial, but it gets caught up in these stupid. I don't even know if I call it culture war stuff, but it just gets caught up in this because it ultimately generally for 75% of the population is very popular. It's things that everybody can benefit from, and it's not just spending money. It's actually something that we're investing in people. So I think our framing needs to be good and needs to get around get our heads around what we need to do to to tell people what they're getting from this massive investment that we're making.
And that it's a long-term investment. I mean, I think politically, I don't know if in a year or two people will recognize this child tax credit or something that they're tangibly seeing is because of the bills that pass. But long-term, when you think about pre-K and the child tax credit that truly had a change in how in poverty, those are really long-term investments that will pay off. I mean, politically, they may not for the short term, but structurally, for the long term, it will change the fabric of our tax system, our childcare system, our education system.
Yeah,
so you
exactly.
Keep focus on that too, because I don't think there'll be a short-term benefit.
Well, so earlier I mentioned that I had a piece, the first article in tomorrow's newsletter, and I think it kind of pertains to all of this specifically. So there's a piece in Salute America, which I'd never actually heard of this place before, although the author I do follow on Twitter. There's an article about transportation insecurity. And so apparently it's some researchers at the University of Michigan have come up with 16 questions to determine transportation insecurity. And they've modeled it after the food insecurity, stuff that's been happening. And I don't know if you all have seen this, but all of the things that they talk about and all the questions that they have the 16, questionnaire that they put together, kind of a qualitative research, thinking about the transportation security, and all the things it feels like are in this list of things that make people transportation insecure are all part of the BBB bill, right? Losing wages or getting fired due to being late to work because of infrequent buses, getting denied care at doctors or denied resources at social services office, being late to missing appointments because of you're depending on friends or family to provide rides, foregoing spending on essentials like food and medications due to cost of vehicle ownership, foregoing trips to resources and services like workforce training, healthy cooking classes due to spending a long time waiting or traveling because of transfers, lack of community cohesion due to feeling socially isolated because of lack of safe options to get around, feeling bad about inconveniencing friends, family, or neighborhoods due to needing help for transportation because of various barriers, worrying about all the things that came before that, healthcare, childcare, all these things, all of it's, and I say this all the time, it's all tied together. It's all connected to quality of life issues. And so I think that, there's something to be said about all these things being tied together, like you all have said too. I mean, they're super connected, and I don't think you can disconnect them anymore because we know better.
We do. So many of our legislators do too. The majority of them do also. It's just a matter of political will, right?
All right. Any final statements before we go to the next section?
No, that was a great discussion.
Good. Well, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month and you get some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you'll get our bus-only scarf. You can also get the bus-only scarf by going to theoverheadwire.com. Puppies and Butterflies. This is the part of the show where we didn't get to talk about actually, this is part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in any of the other sections. Anybody have a Puppies and Butterflies for this week, aside from a passing bill? Any interesting television shows? Any fun stuff going on? Good Halloween costumes?
I went to my first music festival.
Oh, first post-pandemic music.
Yeah, at Outside Lands in San Francisco and in Golden Gate Park. And yeah, it felt almost normal.
I was gonna say, how did it feel? Like, does it feel weird to be around people again, or is it like, how's that?
Well, I felt really old.
I mean,
because everyone was a lot younger than me. But my husband and I, we were troopers. Well, you had to be vaccinated to get in, and people wore masks, but I, just kind of stayed. Not by myself, but I wasn't up in the mosh pit or anything, so I felt okay. And it felt fine. it was fun. So hopefully we can start to get back into the swing of things.
Yeah, I really hope so. Tracy, did you get any good trick or treaters? Like any good costumes or anything?
No, we're in a pretty quiet neighborhood right now for that, so that was a little bit of a bummer. I was in the Bay Area this past week, and I was excited to ride BART and AC Transit, and it was great to be back on Bay Area Transit, various forms of it this week. Didn't get to ride the ferry, which is always lovely, but
yeah. Well, so we sat outside for a little while for Halloween and handed out some candy to kids who were passing by. And I still hadn't had anybody ring the doorbell or anything yet when we were inside. But finally, at about 9:35, I guess because our house was decorated accordingly, the kids, and they weren't old. I expected them to be teenagers, but they were actually smaller kids, and they knocked on the door, and I actually had to run back and get the candy because we had already gone inside. But we gave out a fair amount of our candy this year, which I was super excited about. So although we ate a lot of it during the month of October, I think a lot of it got eaten. But other than that, we've just been watching Great British Bake Off and all that other stuff that goes along with your and Ghosts. Have you seen Ghosts? This is on CBS.
No, we haven't.
Chrissy, have you seen Ghosts? Okay,
I haven't.
It's fun. Basically, this mansion, the family has kind of passed down this mansion throughout the many years, and the last relative passes away, but everybody who dies on the property, they're ghosts and they stay there. And so one of the people who come are like a distant relative of one of the people. And I don't know, it's just funny. It's just like having ghosts around the house. They're funny. They're not like scary or anything like that. It's just like they're people who lived. Yeah, they're relatives and people who had lived in the area. So it's just kind of funny. I don't know. Always looking for something fun to watch on TV that's not too serious, and it's definitely not too serious. So check that out.
I need some of that. We've been watching the morning show, and that's intense. And we watched Hacks on HBO. That was kind of good. I think we've caught up on that. But and also the Great British Baking Shows. And I'm an episode behind, so that might be what I do once we get off the phone here.
Okay, I won't tell you what happens.
Okay.
All right. Well, Chrissy, where can folks find you online?
At Mancini Chrissy and at mycuriouscity.com.
And Tracy, where can folks find you online?
They can find me on Twitter at TE McMillan.
And you can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at theoverheadwire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thank you, Tracy and Chrissy, for being on the 100th episode of Mondays at The Overhead Wire.
Congrats.
And we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Talking